Welcome, everyone, to ArtsNow Presents. The topic for today's conversation is project budgets. We're so excited to have Michelle from Akron Zoo, who's going to be walking us through this information. We're going to be recording, and at the very end, those of you who are watching at home, we're going to go off recording for the question and answer portion, because we want to make sure everybody in this virtual room feels really comfortable asking their questions and getting some answers on specific projects. So if you at home are watching and need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Project budgets are really, really important. They're important not only to ArtsNow and the Arts Forward grant process. Knowing how to put one together thoughtfully helps broadly, whether you're looking at a contract position and work that you're hiring out, or whether you're a nonprofit who's looking at grant funding. The project budget, I've always said, is sort of your moral document. Anyone should be able to look at your budget and be able to tell what it is you care about and what you prioritize by merit of where your money is being sent. So we're really excited to be able to have this conversation today. With that, I am going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Michelle from the Akron Zoo. Michelle, just let us know when you're ready for us to advance a slide, but thank you so much for being here with us today. We're really excited to have you. Thanks, Michelle. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, yeah, and thank you for having me, and welcome and good afternoon, everyone. As Nicole mentioned, I'm Michelle, and I work at the Akron Zoo as Director of External Affairs, and grant funding is one of three major responsibilities in my job. But I actually started as the grant writer for the zoo here in 2020 is when I came here. And this was after working in various grants related roles at various points in a very bizarre and complicated career at various organizations since I graduated college in 1993, which is forever ago. And in that time, I've seen a lot of changes in the grants world. Back when I started, you prepared hard copies, you sometimes even had to type them out on a typewriter. And then you would need to send 7 identical copies by snail mail, to the situation that we're now in, which is mostly computerized submissions, which has, simplified the process significantly. Um, at the zoo, I'll just let you know real briefly, grants make up a relatively small portion of our funding here at the zoo. But what they do fund, and what I would encourage you to think about, is that they allow us and are used to provide essential and mission critical programming. Our mission at the zoo is to connect your life to wildlife while inspiring lifelong learning and conservation action. If you know Doug Piakosh, you probably know that very well. But grants are really what allow us to provide direct programming in communities and to populations that typically face financial barriers to interacting with the zoo. We're able to provide direct programming and education, both in school settings and outside of those settings, in conservation work, in research to help wildlife, and also for a number of special projects. They've also, over the years, allowed us to develop organizationally, which you probably see in our physical landscape. Capital funding has been something that the zoo, has pursued, probably even more so than program funding from the very beginning days. And we've also received funding to build our own internal organizational capacity. Our grant funders are extremely diverse. We apply to funders that are very small, run by a family, and they're allocating amounts of like $1,500, $2,000, $5,000, all the way to funders that are, make available hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more. And those are usually governmental funders at the federal and state level that are providing those sorts of monetary amounts. In my experience, the process isn't like extremely different for those two categories. Just the larger category, the government, and some very sophisticated private foundations just require a lot more elaboration, but the process is essentially the same for all funders that you're going to encounter. And budgets are obviously very important part of the grant application. Um, I would say though they're also a mysterious part of the application. Grant-focused education, at least in my experience, it's not exclusive, and this is a wonderful, counterpoint to what I'm about to say, but that education does tend to be more focused on the writing part. And it makes sense because writing does consume more of the grant writer's attention and time. I think another reason that it's so mysterious is that, the time we typically have with funders in the pre-application stage is limited. And you might not have planned ahead enough to even ask your budget questions. I think it is typical that people wait until it's sort of like the last thing they do because it seems the least daunting, but I would recommend flipping that and just starting with your budget, at least thinking about the questions that you might have if you have an opportunity to make contact with your funder. If you have any pointed questions, if you've looked ahead and have one chance at a phone call, you have an opportunity to ask anything in that budget that is, a question to you. I think it is also important to know or think about that budgets are the first thing that some funders look at. They will not necessarily read your application from start to finish. Typically, the budget comes at the very end of a lengthy packet. And they are not necessarily looking that in the order you intended them to read it. Funders and the reviewers have seen a lot of budgets. They will notice if something about your budget looks off or on. And if your budget is lost, you might have lost a reviewer entirely. So it is very much worth your time to devote serious attention and time to it and not leave it to the last minute, as I have heard some people do. Cough, cough. Our goal today really is just to walk through the steps and elements that, in my experience or opinion, it takes to produce a compelling project budget. And other people might have other ideas, but these are my ideas and kind of how I approach it and how I go through it. So I really sincerely thank you for joining today. I hope you get something out of this, and thank you for slogging through this because budgets, they're budgets. Next slide, please. Okay, so the purpose of a budget, I think, is completely intuitive to most people. We all want and need to access grant funds to be able to carry out some meaningful project or a portion of the work that's associated with our larger mission. And we all know that it takes money to do that. For the funder, the budget really serves two purposes. It is a full explanation of the cost basis for whatever it is you are trying to accomplish. And it also helps the funder feel more confident in the pitch you are making or the story you're telling them about how you're going to get from point A to point B, which, of course, point B is something wonderful and great for the world. The cost basis. So this is, sometimes very difficult to do because you're having to think about every detail and every cost that's associated with steps along the way. And we all know in reality, things do come up and change, and what you originally thought isn't going to, it becomes clear it's not going to work well. But it's your job at this very beginning of stage to really walk yourself through everything it's going to take to get from the date that you get the notice of an award to the completion of your project. Every expense you'll accumulate, you need to think through and how you're going to pay for those expenses, which might be a single funder and it might be more than one source. The expenses that you come up with and think through should track very closely to the narrative portion of your application. So, the big part that you wrote. And the bottom line is, if you mention something in your narrative, have it accounted for in the budget. So if your narrative mentions you have 3 staff that are working on this project, make sure you make it clear there are 3 staff in your budget. If you mention you're serving a meal, that should be in the budget. If you are planning a trip to Columbus as part of the delivery of your project, put that in your budget, and so on and so forth. It's of course going to be unique to you, but you just make sure you're correlating the narrative with your budget. And this really does contribute to the storytelling. The main thing that you're looking to communicate, I think, with a budget is how you are going to carry through with your plan successfully. So your narrative ideally is telling the story of how your participant will be different, or how a problem is going to be solved as a result of the work they're funding. And the budget is adding details and sort of making it pop in a way that that you can't put that degree of detail necessarily in the narrative, but it really does help round out that picture in the reviewer's mind of what your project is going to look like on the ground. And I think another thing not to forget about is that the budget, when it's a good budget and a complete budget, it shows that you know what you're doing, that you're going to be able to execute on the project, and that you already have a lot of things teed up to get started when the money arrives. And I think that's a big part of securing grants, is instilling confidence in your abilities, and the budget does help you do that. Next slide, please. General overview on the budget components. It's really something that we all know, revenue and expenses. So revenue is really all of the funds coming in and that are able to support the cost of the project. We're going to spend a lot more time on this in a minute, but the main source of funds in most nonprofit budgets are going to be other grants, earned income, and possibly your own contributions. And that could apply to individual, artists as well. Expenses are all of the costs you will incur. Those include the direct costs like staffing, materials that you're going to use during the grant term to fulfill the project, as well as indirect costs like your overhead and administrative costs. The most important thing to keep in mind is that in most instances, you want revenue and expenses to balance in the grant budget. I'm really bad with graphic design, but I wanted to put Yoda in here. I couldn't really figure out very well how to do that, but hopefully he is in your head and you're hearing him say, balance you must. The funder wants to see that you're going to have enough income coming in to cover the project as you've proposed it, if they are, just one funder among many. And, think about it from their perspective. They have a lot of competition for scarce funding, and it's probably just going to get more and more competitive as we go along. They don't want to fund a project that is not going to have enough funds to accomplish what the organization said it would be able to accomplish. And, especially when there are dozens or even hundreds of other applicants that have wonderful, beneficial projects just like yours. They do have to draw a line. So, one thing you're doing with this is showing that your revenue will meet your expenses. Another thing to note, that it is perfectly acceptable to let a funder know that you can and will make your own contribution to complete the project. This is, excuse me, not always required, but in instances it is. Most funders do not require it, but there are some that are going to expect a contribution from you. An issue that you might encounter when you're trying to balance your budget is that your revenue comes in higher than your expenses. And that could be because you expect your project to make some earned income from sales. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or because you are adding grant opportunities to your budget that you don't necessarily expect to get. So it's always best really to work a budget with having identified revenue that you know, or at least feel is a very good possibility that you are going to be successful in receiving. So that, focus really on those funders that that have supported you before or support you consistently, or, you've at least talked to them and they have indicated their openness to your proposal. Making those phone calls is such a great thing to do, because it gives you a chance to, gauge the temperature on what it is you are proposing to them. And in the case that you have an income generating portion of your project, it is important to make sure that making funds like that, like if you're selling t-shirts or selling art or selling something at your actual event, and it goes higher than your expenses, it's just, it's important for you to know that the funder allows that and supports that. Slide, please. Okay. So once you have generally an idea that you need to deal with revenue and you need to deal with expenses, the first thing that you want to do when you're getting started is to check the guidelines. So all funders operate by their own guidelines and principles, and these are typically published on their website, or old days you actually called them on the phone and asked them to mail them to you. And sometimes those guidelines include allowable and unallowable costs. Now, that is not always the case. That is not always published. And there might not be, some foundations might have less limits than others. But you will want to know if that applies to the funder that you're working with. So if we look at the examples on the left, is a local education focused foundation here in the region. And at first, they tell you what they're looking for in a budget, but at the bottom, they're saying what we do not fund. And that includes a pretty long list of things, including capital improvements, indirect costs, travel expenses, school bus transportation, admission fees, school supplies, refreshments, t-shirts, things like that. If you look at on the right, the Ohio Arts Council, they have, this is just part of their list. I had to cut it to be able to fit on the slide. And, some of the same things that our other group didn't want to fund is also something that the Ohio Arts Council does not allow, which includes hospitality expenses. So if you were going to have food and beverage at an event, Ohio Arts Council funds cannot be used for that. Out-of-state travel, any kind of messaging that has a political or religious theme to it, and recreational or therapeutic activities, unless the activity is art making. So, it might work for you, it might not. You want to really read these closely and have a good sense of what this funder allows and does not allow, so that you could have wasted your time entirely if you didn't read this and you put in the cost of a field trip and food for your participants. You need to just think about what's possible and impossible given the total mix of funders that you have in mind for a particular project. And also, it's okay to think if a funder is right for this particular project. They might not be, and it's better to, align the funder's interests with your interests, than to spend time on one funder that is an automatic dead end when there might be somebody else there who would be a yes. Slide, please. The second step is to find and use the funder's budget template. So this is usually a fillable spreadsheet or some other type of form that's broken into revenue and expense lines. Funders do not always require that you use their template. You know, many of them are open to using your own. But in my opinion, that is not advisable. It's always best practice, in my opinion, to use what the funder has provided. And just think about it. They are telling you how to present the information in the way that they would like to see it, and that makes sense for them. So do that. Do it. The templates here, so the one on the right is for Arts Forward, and the one on the left is a community foundation in the region. And I just want to walk through them each. Every funder has a different template. They all look just a little bit different. There are similarities and threads that run across, but some of them are incredibly complicated and some of them are more straightforward. The Arts Forward budget template. What we have is a template that is divided into expense and revenue sections with, a relatively small amount of columns and, some open-ended lines where you can add line items that are specific to your project, as well as line items that are typical that they want to see. The first one, that we see is just asking to actually put what you're asking from them right there in the budget. And it's, I would say, a very typical grant template. The one on the left is from a community foundation in our region. And it's complex. And if you encounter something like this one, you really need to give it some thought, and a different kind of thought than the typical grant budget form. This one that they've provided is completely open-ended. But if you are stumped by an open-ended template, just look at other grant budget proposals that you've either forms that you've used to apply for other organizations or samples on the website, and you can get a sense of what typical revenue line items would be and expense line items. And in this one, they're asking you for each and every line item, expense line item in your budget, to make a contribution from your organization, which really, it can be zero. I mean, you might not be able to contribute to every line item. They're asking how many other funders are supporting that line item and what you are asking from them. This is a big ask. It's hard. And really what you want to think about, I think, is two things. The first would be, if you know this foundation and you know their preferences, and they prefer funding supplies to staff time, put their contribution in staff time. That's kind of relatively easy. If you don't know them well, I think the best course of action or strategy for you is to think about in-kind contributions, and we'll define these terms in a minute. What in-kind contributions can you make relatively easily, like your facilities that you would be paying for anyway, or volunteer labor that you have committed volunteers, and you can, in a sense, use the value of that labor as your contribution, and try to isolate your contribution in a budget like this to those line items that are going to be a lighter lift for your organization to meet. Slide. Okay, so now we're just going to go a little bit deeper into the line items. And we'll start first with revenue and making sure that we leave here with a good understanding and definition of what each of these terms mean. So the funder grant. The funder grant, as we saw in the Arts Forward budget template, that is the amount that you're requesting from this particular funder. And it's a choice that you have to make as the applicant. Now, ArtsNow and many other funders do provide an upward limit on a grant ask. But asking for the max is not always the right approach. You want to do your homework. You want to look, and you can get this data from the IRS Form 990, and most of them are published on the web. They exist out there, so you can freely look them up. You want to understand the range of their grants. Like, what do they typically, even if they have a max of, say, $100,000, what do they actually end up giving? And you also want to think about the giving patterns in the type of organization or grant seeker that you are. So if you're an arts organization or an artist and you see that they give really high grants, but they're all for medical research, and the amount of grants that they give to art and artists is a lower amount, you want to just put yourself in the pack of other like organizations. So you do want to take a little bit of time to acquaint yourself with the giving patterns of funders that are available to you. And after you kind of have a good feel for the range that a particular funder is contributing to similar organizations to yourself, you ideally will talk to that funder and together determine what's a reasonable ask for the project that you are proposing to them. And you get a lot of great tips and comments and sometimes like questions that you might not have thought of. Okay, the other revenue line items, other foundation and government grants, that is if you're working on a project, especially in the 501c3 space, this is likely to be a large part of your project budget. And those grant funds are wonderful because they are funds that are given in support of a particular aim without the expectation that you will pay them back. However, there is the expectation if that you don't spend it all, you are likely to be returning that funding if you don't complete the project. In other words, grants tend to be restricted. There are some that aren't, that are for general operating, but typically most grant funds are for specific purposes. Budget templates sometimes ask for you to list and state the amount that you are going to apply to individual grant makers. And some of them don't. Some allow you just to talk about that in a lump sum kind of way. And it's a difficult choice for you to make if the budget form that you're using doesn't specify what they prefer. In identifying every single grant funder that you are going to be approaching, there can be downsides to that, but there could be upsides to it. There could have a foundation bestie that is all giving you stuff, has already confirmed a contribution, and that might work in your favor. It really, it's a guessing game. If they ask for names, though, you do need to provide them. I will say at the zoo, we do usually stick with lump sums if there is not a requirement, but it is something that you should weigh and think about. Sponsorships is another typical revenue line item, and these are sums paid to carry out your project, but there is an expectation of recognition or other benefits. So there is a little bit of contingency on the support, but it's usually not a heavy lift. Earned income is anything that you are going to bring into the project, like from end users paying for a good or a service or something. So that could be things like admission tickets, the sale of merch, or concessions that you might be selling at an event or in a venue. It is important to mention if you are expecting earned income. And I just think it's better to present that material, that information in separate line items if you have multiple sources of earned income, so that, they get a good sense of what you're expecting from the different things that you are charging for. In kind. So these are goods or services donated to you to carry out the project. But typically they do have a dollar amount associated with them, and you can estimate the value of donated items or services to add to your budget. Volunteer labor is a very important source of in-kind contribution. Some funders, will tell you the maximum amount of volunteer labor that you can claim on a grant application, but most do not. Independent Sector does a study each year, and they evaluated an hour of a volunteer's time at $34.79 per hour in 2024, which I will say, honestly, I would be really reticent to use that as my cost basis for volunteer labor, simply because that's including, New York City, San Francisco, places that have a much higher, cost of living than we do here in the area. And it might even be more than you're making as the director. So, you just do want to think about what is a fair evaluation for volunteer labor if you are planning to include that as part of your project budget. And finally, another source of revenue that we want to think about is that organizational contribution. We've already talked about it a little bit. You might want to add an organizational contribution even if it's not required, because you need to balance your budget. And it's important to think that in many cases, you should always check with the foundation or the funder, but cash or in-kind resources that you're supplying oftentimes count toward that contribution. So those are the basic line items. I also just want to call attention, and this is a very important point, that most grant budgets, including the Arts Forward template that we just saw, they ask you to note whether the revenue that you are expecting has been confirmed, is pending, or is planned. And, you have to provide that information. There could be cases where this is the very first one, that funder that you've applied to, that you've actually, submitted. And that's okay. You just need to be upfront about that you do not at this point have any funding confirmed, but you have plans for soliciting from other grant makers in the area. And when depending on how you put your budget together, you might want to identify by name those foundations and say whether they have confirmed or not. But even if you're presenting your budget in lump sums, you will still want to make it clear that if funding has been confirmed, planned, or pending. And what I've done is just put, if I'm using a lump sum, other foundations or other grants, I will say have a line, grants confirmed, grants pending, grants planned, with the amounts in those budgets. So it's all clear to the group that I'm applying to. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, so the expenses. This is just the other side of the coin. But this side is a lot more time consuming and complicated, I would say, than the revenue side. And it does require you to do some upfront work. And that work really is gathering the true estimates for your expense items. So applicants, we should not be guessing. There might be cases, grant makers, cover your ears when we have to guess a little bit, but really you should do as much legwork as you possibly can. And there are cases where funders will actually ask you for a physical copy of the bid or estimate or a price that is a part of the application. So just be aware if there is any requirement like that. Okay, common expense lines, staffing. This is sort of an obvious one, but in that line, you want to include salaries and wages as well as benefits for each assigned staff member that is going to be working on, you want to think about all of the planning work they need to do, the delivery work, which, in some cases is less work than the planning, and the travel time. At the zoo, we do a lot of work out in the community, so sometimes we'll add the travel time from getting from the zoo to that community site and back. Really, in this part of the budget is when you want to be really up close and personal with your finance people and with your program people if you divide labor that way. You want to just get the actual names of the people on staff that will be assigned to the project and the hours that you expect to see in each of those buckets. So planning, delivery, and travel, just in your head, keep it separate. And then check with finance to find out the actual salaries. This is if you work in an organization like ours. If you're an independent contractor or individual, it's a little bit different and probably easier. But you want to make sure that you are accounting for the actual salaries of the people that are going to be most likely working on this. Of course, stuff happens, people quit, all of that. But to the best of your knowledge, you want it to be as accurate to the true people that will be assigned, and also account for any raises that might happen during the duration of the project. So if there's 4 months where they're going to be at one wage level, but raises come about in April every year, and their wage is going to go up 2%, account for that so that you're not shorthanded at the end. And you can put a note to that effect as well. You also do want to split them into line items. So if you have 3 people working on it, make it clear that there are 3 separate staff people with their own cost basis, their own wage level, their own, different hours. Hours might vary between the staff assigned. And in the actual, for privacy's sake, in the form, you don't need to put their names, but you can put the separate titles so that it's very clear to the funder who is working on what, and sort of even what the accountability structure might be. Benefits are quite easier. It's typically just a % of a salary. So you can typically calculate that without finance if benefits are something that you're providing to the people that are going to be working on the project. We always report that as a lump sum, so we don't break it out by particular individual employee. Another big line item is materials and supplies. So these are the consumables to carry out the project. I would just say, think about the supplies you're going to need to actually deliver the project, that you're going to use as you're delivering, but also think about some of those supplies you might use for marketing, like pre-stamped postcards or poster board or anything that you're going to be doing in-house that has a cost and has a good associated to it. Make sure you add that to your budget. And you're also going to want to check the prices and write it down somewhere. It's so easy to forget what you actually budgeted out if you don't keep a good and proper file on what is coming down, what you hope will be coming down the pike. So you just want to remember it all when it comes time to buy. And obviously there's a big time horizon between applying for a grant and actually receiving the funds, and prices do sometimes change, but you're doing your best. You're doing your best. Equipment is something that probably, it applies in some cases. There are some foundations and grant funders that will not allow you to cover the cost of equipment, and others do. It's tricky because of depreciation and all of that, and what happens to the equipment when the project is over. So that if you are planning, if you need equipment, that is something that you want to speak to your funder about. Facilities is another cost that are commonly added into project budgets. At the zoo, it's real easy because typically when we add a facilities line item, it's because we're renting an area of the zoo or a classroom or something that will be used as part of the program. Now, others of you might not have that case. You might be working out of your home. And if you have a dedicated space in that home, you just kind of want to prorate. If you're creating a huge piece of art that's going to be in your garage for 3 months and you can't use your garage otherwise, that is something that can be charged to a grant, but you need to figure out like how long is it going to be there? What is the space, proportional to the overall space of my home or my office, and what is the portion of that facility that is being used for this project. Travel, transportation is another one, and we've already kind of talked about it, but just important to mention, the federal mileage rate is 70 cents per mile. And so if you are using your own vehicle in the course of carrying out your project, that is something that you can add to your budgets. Like here at the zoo, we don't do it when we're doing local travel for a grant funded project, but we will add that cost when we're going far. So just something to think about. And, the downside of doing it is it's a lot of paperwork and keeping track of the actual mileage expenditure. Contractors, vendors, this will be a biggie. This is anybody who's outside of your organization that is supplying goods or services for your project. And you, like with suppliers, you want to get bids or estimates from your suppliers. This is going to take advanced planning in a lot of cases. It's not like their prices are necessarily up on Amazon.com. So you're going to need to put a little bit of foresight into adding contractors to your budget. But you do want to get copies of the bids and keep them for your records. So definitely leave enough time for that. Program evaluation is an increasing cost. Most private foundations do not require formal evaluation, but some government funders do, and that would be the cost. If you have a plan to hire a surveyor or something like that, you can put that in the budget in a lot of cases to demonstrate your performance. I'm trying to go through this quick, and I'll stop in a second for any questions, but administrative costs. So that's your overhead. That's just the background costs of running a business. And not all funders allow it. We saw on our slides several ahead that local education funder does not provide it allow it, for instance. But if you are applying to a funder that allows it, take advantage of it, because you are assuming costs just indirectly by carrying out projects. And that is really your overhead costs. It's awesome that ArtsNow allows it. ArtsNow allows it, but they leave it up to you to calculate. So that's something that can be a hard question. There are some organizations, banks are like pretty known for this, where they just allow up to 10% administrative costs, and that's it. That's what you can count on as your indirect costs. And the federal government does have a blanket rate as well. And they recently upped that from 10 to 15% of the project cost for administrative costs that you can tack on to a grant funded project. So, if you're applying for a federal opportunity, definitely use the 15% unless you have your own negotiated indirect cost rate. But that 15% rate might be a sticker shock to foundations that allow it, because 10% has been the norm for a very long time. So I would stick with 10% or less. That's kind of how I approach it when we're allowed to add costs like that into our project budget. And final is fiscal agency a fiscal agent or administrator, the cost of that. So if this is only going to apply to applicants that do not have their own 501c3. But if you are working with a fiscal agent to be able to accept grant funds and they charge you a fee, you should definitely include that as part of your expenses. So I will stop there for a second and see if there's any questions or comments. And if not, we can move on to the next portions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This is so helpful. Folks, I'm going to change the settings so that you can come off mute if you have any questions. But I think one question I have, Michelle, just to kick it off is, you mentioned depreciation. Could you explain in just a couple words what that is in case folks aren't used to accounting for that?
Yes, and quite honestly, I do not know a ton about it because I legally am not on that side of the house. But depreciation in general is when you purchase equipment, and you can think of it like your own car. If you buy your car, the minute you drive it on the lot, its value is declined. Typically it declines in value. I guess it's possible that something could increase in value too. But when you are reporting on that, if you purchased equipment as part of a project, it might not, it's likely not to maintain its value at the point that you need to report to your grant funder. So that is all something that you need to be able to account for. Most private foundations, if they allow you to buy equipment, they're going to let you keep it. There are other funders that won't. They expect you to turn it back, or it becomes the property of the government, stuff like that. And in that case, they want to understand what the value is. You might need to pay back. We really don't go there very often, so I don't have direct experience with it. But it's a much more complicated accounting issue. Like I said, most private foundations or funders in the area that are really know you well and want to support your project, they're going to let you keep it at the end. So it might not be an issue for you, even if you're allowed to put it in depreciation. But just know that when you're purchasing something, it's likely to lose value over the life of the project.
Thank you, Michelle. That's helpful. And for some of us who are individuals or small organizations, one of the ways ArtsNow kind of moved to address this without overburdening us is that we put a financial policy in place that we would not track depreciation under $10,000. So you're not spending time every year trying to calculate exactly how much that one laptop that you purchased 5 years ago is depreciated in value. So it can also be another way to kind of address it. For some place like the zoo where you have so much equipment and infrastructure, it's a little bit different. But for those of us on this Zoom, we are kind of the smaller ones. It might not be as
Sure.
necessary. And also we have a question. Tony, do you want to come off mute, or we can just read, Michelle, the question in the chat is, are admin costs separate from the cost you consider for an employee to manage the project?
Yes. So administrative costs are generally, every organization has a lot of, they have their administrators, they have their CEO, they have their C-suite. If you're a one-person shop, that might not be the case, but assuming you have at least a couple employees, they might not work directly on the project, but some funders recognize that those costs are still accumulating. Keeping the lights on, paying your service provider for your internet, all of that. And so that's their way of giving your organization a little bit of support. Now, if somebody is working directly on your project and is called a project manager, or something comparable, that is a direct program staff. So anybody that is dedicated and assigned and knows, yeah, this project is my job, at least a part of my time, that is a separate line item than the administrative.
Okay, I did come off mute because with the organization I'm involved in, we have one employee. She's an executive director, and we have different projects and events that we may do. And so we should account for her time that she spends putting that project together, even though we're volunteers are helping too, but she has to dedicate time to make sure the project happens or the event happens. But then also, our administrative costs could be accounting, insurance, and things like that. But within that budget that we're putting together, we still need to account for both of those things.
Correct. Yeah. So if your executive director is taking an active role and you know this person is gonna spend 20 hours a week for the next 5 weeks on this project, yes, it's to your advantage to put them as a direct staff of the project, and add administrative costs, because like, the executive director's time isn't just the only cost. Now, some are, it's difficult when you're dealing, this becomes more of an issue for government funders that really sometimes, well, they're challenging it more. They're challenging those indirect costs more and want you to be very aware of how every different category that you would add in administrative costs, like how it all adds up. And it's difficult. It's very difficult. And some, I would say a lot of the funders that we apply to don't even allow it. So it's not an issue. And if our executive director is going to work on it, we would add to staffing or just keep him out. Because the other side of it is you do want to keep good records. And like, we track our time. Everybody below the C-suite tracks our time and has a fairly good counting of time. C-suite doesn't. Here at the zoo, we have like 6 C-suite members, including our executive director, and he doesn't track his time. So I stay out of that. We'll add his time for free to the project, just because I can't track on it, I can't report it. So that's just something to think about as well. Make sure that whoever you're putting in your staff, in your staffing line item, you have a way to really understand at the end of the day how much they actually worked on the project.
Thank you for that. And is it also different for because we're talking about like grants? I know like with a lot of times grants, they don't particularly care how you get the project done. They just want to see like the end result. But when you are having donors that are just donating to like the cause, then you can have those administrative costs and personnel costs in there as well. Or you should consider those.
Yes, I think you should. The better approach is just to put it out there, I think.
Okay.
And like I said in the beginning, there's such a diversity of organizations that you might be seeking funding from, and everybody has like a fairly different reporting process. We're going to get to this in a slide in a minute, but if you get these funds, they're going to expect you to account for them, both the funds and your activities, what you did. And they're looking to see that you carried it out with, they say with fidelity, with, pretty as close as possible to what you told them you were going to do. And, on the ground, I think funders are, flexible, and they understand things come up, or the idea you had when you made the application just like wasn't workable. It didn't work well, so you pivot. When you're making really big pivots, you should be checking in with your funders for sure, just to make sure that how you are changing is in line with their priority and their commitment to you. So like an example, we got a relatively small grant for books for to distribute to kids that take part in an education program that we do. We thought that the books would be a certain price. but they actually came in shockingly a little lower than what we anticipated. So just kind of knowing this funder, I knew that they just were interested in the books. They didn't really want to provide funds for any other of the line items in our budget. So, our project was to go out to schools and deliver programming in a school classroom and distribute the books to the kids in those classrooms. Well, all of a sudden we've got like $400 left over. And we do other programming with the library. So our idea was, hey, we could, distribute the leftover books to those kids that we meet at the library. And so I had to ask, is that okay? And I still am waiting on an answer, simply because there's been a little back and forth, and she really wanted a lot of specifics about which libraries and all of that. So I need to prepare all of that information, but you just kind of have to work. If you're making a change, like in this case, just from school to library setting, they might want to know about it. And on the back end, they might be mad if you just make the change without asking. So that's just, something to be aware of. When you're making a change, it doesn't take a lot to just reach out to them and let them know you had to do so. I hope that answered the question.
That was very helpful advice, Michelle. I would just echo that most funders just want to know what you're up to, so that none of us like surprises, and they really don't. So it's always helpful to just stay in communication with your program officer. That's really great advice, Michelle. Any other
Yeah.
questions at this stage, knowing we're going to have time off camera to ask questions as well at the end?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, Coach Ebony. How are you?
Hi, Ebony Hill. I couldn't change my name on here,
You're fine.
but it didn't give me the option. But I wanted to say hello and thank you so much for this space. This is so helpful. I wanted to just hear a little bit more about asking for the appropriate amount versus the funding max. Workshops I've gone to, they've always said ask for the max. So this is the first time I'm hearing different, and I just wanted to hear a little more.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a matter of agreement or disagreement, but I mean, we've definitely gotten rejected because our ask amount was too high. So, I think being thoughtful about it is going to set you up for more success. And that's just, from my experience, we have definitely lost out on opportunities because the funder was like, whoa, that's a lot of money, and they do know, because they read a lot of applications. They know if what you're saying you're going to do shouldn't cost that much. They know that just because they've seen other groups do it for less. So personally, I feel like it's a little risky. I think the other thing about automatically asking for the max, now if the max is $5,000, this doesn't apply. But if it's a lot, it can be too much too soon for you to handle. And so I think another thing, kind of selfishly or in a self-preservation kind of mode, you want to make sure you're grant ready. And you can get in over your head with a huge grant. And you might find yourself at the end, we're kind of getting ahead to some of the slides, but if you are not able to spend it, and I will say that happens, it definitely happens that you're not able to spend what you thought you were going to spend. When you get into an underspending situation, you might be returning funds that you don't have, that you spend on other part, that's not in your bank. So personally, and this could be a matter of taste or approach, or I mean, I am prone to anxiety, so there's that, but I just like to keep it a real good handle on what is the norm for others, because I don't want to be rejected. And also what we can as ourselves, given the resources we have available to us, which is going to vary organization to organization, can we manage that appropriately? So those are the two considerations that I bring to that whole, what is the right amount to ask for a question. And I do typically, like I said, try to run it by the grant officer if I can.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Why don't
You're
we continue with the slideshow, and then let's make sure we're leaving time at the end as well for questions, which we can do off screen as well. So thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, and this we can kind of go through. I know this is taking longer than when I practiced.
So
It
much good
didn't.
information, Michelle.
So other considerations, I just wanted to like draw attention to one other piece of most grant applications, and this was on the Arts Forward grant application as well, is that on the budget template form, there is a line for notes. And those notes are your opportunity to really show them what the cost is going to be. So what I will do, like for an example, you want to like on a notes column, you want them to understand what they're seeing and why it costs the amount you said it will cost. So like on our budgets, if the project manager is working on the project, I will say, you know, we're estimating 15 hours at $30 an hour for 12 weeks for planning, and then 5 hours at $30 an hour for 5 weeks for delivery. If we said there are 3 different employees working on the project or 3 different people, you know, realistically, they're not going to be working the exact same amount of time. You know, the project assistant might work more, you know, than the project manager does on any one particular project. So I take that information that I got from my program side, from my program, the people that are going to be there on the ground. And if that's you, you know, if you're wearing all the hats, you already know this, you don't have to ask. But if you're not wearing all the hats, you just need to make it clear how you came up with the amount you did. And in that notes column, they can look, the funder can look and say, oh yeah, look at that. They have really great support for that project. The program manager is going to be in and out of it, but they've got capable people that are checking in. You know, they know that. They can kind of, I mean, they're making some assumptions, but they know how it's going to work on the ground and how much time each person needs to do and how much that person gets paid and why that line item is that much. Benefits, you know, it's typically just, this would just be an example, but it's enough to say that we pay 33% of staff time is what our benefit rate is, and might be different for you, it might be different for other people, but that's, you know, that's the basis for that line item. And then for supplies, I try to do the same. Like if I took all the time to go to Amazon, which I do a lot, or sometimes other suppliers, and figure out what these things cost, like what we literally are going to have to buy. And I know that this is probably like an insult because you guys wouldn't buy Crayola markers or whatever, probably buy better quality supplies than this. But, you know, if this is what I need, if I'm working with kids and we just need some acrylic paint, and this is the cost I was able to find and the best price, I'm just going to put that there so that they know. The other thing, which is sort of separate but is related, is a lot of funders ask for a budget explanation. Some of them don't ask at all. Some of them, like Arts Forward, it was optional to provide a budget explanation, and some funders require it. And this is just a greater elaboration of why a cost is in your budget. So this is your opportunity. I like to keep it short. I like to keep these to 1 to 2 pages max. But this is your opportunity to fill in a little bit more detail. On the notes, you know, we're talking about planning. On the explanation side, you can say what planning entails. It involves developing lesson plans. It involves assigning the staff. It involves scheduling. It involves selecting vendors and actually going out there to assist. You know, or delivery is that. So it, you know, it just creates a picture. You're trying to create a picture for your funder, and let them really understand like all the work that goes into this, because you know, you want to do that with everything. You want to explain everything, but you really want to focus on your staff time because it's going to be the biggest part of the budget. And you want them to understand we really have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work involved in this and we need someone to support it or we can't make it happen. So important to, you know, really do your best to show the basis for your calculation, and when you have the opportunity to explain your justification for why you need 3 people, why. You just want them to walk away understanding why. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, remember, these are just little things to remember. You are being scrutinized. So your funder has a group of people working with him, her, whoever that is going to decide the fate of your application. These reviewers might be in your field and they might be out of it. So you need to be able to speak to both audiences. You need your budget to be clear to people that are in the field and out. And people in the field will probably know immediately if something looks off. So, you don't necessarily know who is reviewing your application. Most of the time, I mean, I don't think I ever know who's reviewing my application. Sometimes it's listed, but most of the time not. So you should just assume that you are going to be sending your application to somebody who knows how it works. And if you have assigned too many or too few staff, or if you can find much cheaper paint out there, or the paint you picked is really low quality, hopefully they wouldn't reject you for that. They would just tell you, like, you could get better, you could get better paint. But you just want to do your best to understand that there are real people on the other side who are bringing their own lens to what they're reading. And you don't know who they are. So you just want to make sure that you are accurate, but also grounded in your field. You want to be relative to your peers. You want to be like, you want to be typical. And then as you're working through revenue, you also want to know that the funding community talks to each other. They know each other very well. And if you put down Foundation A as a source of revenue, and you're putting on an arts festival, but Foundation A really gives like 90% of its money to kidney cancer research, the funder in that room is going to know that and just be like, yeah, that's not happening. That's not realistic. So, you do want to put some thought into who you're considering, who your potential funders are. And, it could be an innocent mistake, but you want to do a little bit of homework. You want to know what everybody cares about. I don't know if I might have said this before, but the Form 990 is just great for that. It's like a font of knowledge for grant seekers. The other thing to remember is you might be successful, and we already talked about this a little bit. If you are successful, you have to report on the project and have a very clear accounting of how you spent down your funds. The options for a funder are full funding or partial funding. You don't always get everything you ask for. And I would even say that is kind of like the norm, that you get less than you ask for. So that might mean, like, as we were talking before, you need to if you get partial funding, you're going to have to readjust, unless, you found somebody else to make up that shortfall that you were expecting. But assuming you don't, you are going to need to adjust the scope of your project. And if you need to make those serious changes, you should be in contact with your program officer. Like I said, everybody is very reasonable and understand flexibility and understand changes need to be made, but it's better, like Nicole said, not to make this a surprise at the very end. But, if there's something serious that needed to change, let them know in advance. And, last thing to mention here is just keep your receipts and your invoices and your payroll system up to date. Whatever that is, whether it's a spreadsheet or, like a platform, like we use here at the zoo, a payroll system. But you also, in the meantime, especially if your grant term is long, you want to be checking in. I try to check in quarterly or at least 3 times a year to make sure our spending is tracking with where we should be at any point to get to the end of it pretty much at a zero balance. Like I said, you don't want to overspend, you don't want to underspend. Overspending means you're eating some of that cost, unless you had, an angel appear at your door with a check. Or if you go under, you might be in a position where you need to return funds, and that's, not a position you ever want to be in. So that is essentially what I wanted to say. I had a couple of slides for just to look at. The next slide, and we probably don't have time to talk about this, but here's an example of a budget. It's kind of like loosely based off a real budget that I saw submitted. And then if you want to go to the next slide. And here's a similar one, or the same one that you could submit. And if we had had time, we could have critiqued them both, because both of them have positives and both of them have negatives. And I was curious to see which one, if you would fund either of them, I think one of the things that I always try to be mindful of is to put myself in the reviewer's shoes. If I was getting this, how would I feel about it? And it helps, it really does. It helps, like, keep in your mind, I'm not being clear. I could give more detail. That's always when I do my last read before hitting that submit button, I edit a lot. I will edit like 4 times. And I make sure that I thought about that person on the other side, or those people on the other side, and what they're going to think of me. And then next slide. And this is just our takeaway. I think the most important thing to think is the budget is rounding out your application. There are other materials, you've written something, hopefully wonderful and very clear, and it sets a tone and a picture for your funder. But what the budget adds to that is it lets your funder know that you have a very solid plan. You do expect enough revenue to cover these expenses, and you have enough staffing, supplies, the quality is there. You have existing vendors that you have relationships that are ready to go the minute you say we need to go. And you have the overall wherewithal to succeed. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is instill confidence in yourself, in the funder. So that's really all I wanted to say. I just did want to point out there are additional resources. Candid is a wonderful one. It's costly, but it is a wonderful source. It's an online platform, and it's a wonderful source for people who are seeking grants. There is a membership organization called the Grants Professionals Association. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you're writing grants a lot, you might want to join this association, and they do provide continuing education as well as networking and that kind of stuff. And the Akron Community Foundation locally, they provide, ArtsNow too, but they provide a lot of continuing education, usually for free, for grant seekers in the area. So you should definitely sign up to stay in touch with them. They have like a weekly newsletter, I believe, and you can find out about everything that they offer. And to my awareness, there might be one thing that you have to pay for, but almost everything is free of charge. So they're a wonderful resource as well. And then organizations like ArtsNow, or like more niche organizations that are servicing a particular type of organization or type of person out there in the world, they might offer their own as well. I wanted to make this a little bit broad, but really, they are all the same. At the end of the day, they're interested in the same kind of information, regardless of what your profession is. And there might be tweaks here and there. There's going to be variations, but as long as you are just going into it having done some homework, you are likely to have a good result. Or if you don't get a good result, give them a call and ask why. And sometimes they will not answer your call, and sometimes they will. And they will give you a wealth of information that you can use going forward. Getting rejected is normal. It happens a lot. So don't take it personally, just try to learn. So that's about all I will say. And if we want to do a couple questions, that's good.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really want to echo your comments on sort of the communication with funders, the looking at your budget as a really important part of a grant application, because funders certainly do. And this has just been such a wealth of knowledge. At this point, I'm going to say thank you for tuning in. For the folks who are joining us virtually, we're going to stop the recording and start the Q&A.